Hello. Today we're going to go cinematic. I'm going to go over one of my oldest renders and see if I can make it more cinematic and more dynamic of an image. I'm going to show my whole workflow from start to finish. So let's get started. So this render, I actually don't have the exact date since I've changed computers since then, so I don't have the original date of when this render was made, but it was probably around early 2014, so it's been 10 years. I like the overall idea of the shot of the cop chasing the racer. The road looks good. It has a displacement. I can't remember if micro displacement was even supported yet. So this could have just been heavily subdivided. I really hope not. We'll say I did model this car myself. Another good thing was I actually rendered this in full 4K. I'm really surprised that I bothered doing that. So my goals for this render, I want it to be much more dynamically lit, better contrast, and I'd like the camera to be in a more cinematic position in this case. The rest of the video will just be time-lapse, but I'm going to share a lot of my workflow tips and what I use along the way. I must confess, I did not use screen caps. I don't know what came over me. I'll have the keyboard shortcuts appear on the screen. If there's any I miss or that you feel are really important, let me know in the comments and I can let you know what those commands are. But yeah, let's jump right into it. So I gathered a few references of different scenes, or at least kind of moments that I wanted to have this to feel like. And so I just used PureRef to copy and paste all the images together into an easy place that I could look at. I started with adding the cars. Thankfully, the Pagani Huayra is part of the TheMEGAFleet add-on. The TheMEGAFleet add-on is basically a big asset browser of lots of different cars with lots of detail and textures. Again, these are not sponsored, but I just found it perfect for my use case, and I think it's very much worth the money. After adding the cars, I made a road that was just to world scale. Also, being true to world scale ensures the camera and lighting is true to form, and that the effects in Blender, which are to world scale, will match the scene you're using. I set a 35mm camera. I think having a good sense of focal lengths is really important when it comes to rendering and how to make it cinematic. I did end up making it a little bit wider later on to 24mm, just since it's a little wider, closer in shot. Get into this playing around stage as soon as possible. In this case, I had the cars ready to go, but you can just use primitives, just cubes, cylinders, spheres, whatever. But the point is to try to get to the point where you can just play around with the composition and get a sense of the composition and movement as soon as possible. I think this also helps with making sure I can finish my projects, just because it feels like I can kind of have the end in sight because I'm at the playing around stage versus just getting stuck in the details of trying to fix something that doesn't even seem relevant in the bigger picture afterward. Get into the stage of being able to play around with your shot and tinker with things as soon as possible. Here I spent more time making the road, making sure the general dimensions were just right by just doing some simple online searches. I realized with the road I would need some extra environment, so I started making the shoulder and basically just used a grid that was subdivided a little bit for displacement eventually. I used the Ant Landscape add-on to add that displacement just to give it a little variation. I used array modifiers as well, and the nice thing about array modifiers is that you can add only as much mesh as you need to. That as well as the mirror modifier in this case, and since the other shoulder's kind of far in the background, it's probably not going to be super noticeable that they're the same. I'll also briefly mention my EnView add-on. In this case, I considered using EnView to clip out parts of the shoulder that wouldn't even be visible anyway. Since I wasn't particularly committed to the camera angle just yet, I waited on it, but this is how I like to use the EnView add-on. It's not meant to be a render as many polygons as you want. It's more of just quick scene management of being able to see what objects or geometry is visible and be able to just remove or manage everything else that isn't. I spent a lot of time on the fence, and it turned out to be a lot more pivotal to the render than I thought, so that's a good thing. We'll say having reference is key. I used a image of a real highway fence as an example. I think another tip that I feel like isn't mentioned regarding reference, have the reference always visible, at least as visible as much as possible while you're working on it. The switching between seeing the reference and then back to your model isn't often enough for your mind to keep the image consistent between the two. It's good to have them both visible at the same time so you can visually with your eyes see both at the same time and see what's different. Here I kept the modeling very simple, just used some simple extrudes or scales. The point that I'm trying to keep my modeling simple for this environment is that I don't know how visible this geometry will be or how detailed it needs to be yet. It's always easier to add detail later, and so in this case I just held off or used modifiers heavily, so that way I could always tweak it later. Scaling and extruding, I just used the S key and the E key respectively, and I decided with this fencing that I didn't just want it off to the side kind of as a separate prop. I wanted the race car to actually, the racing car, it's not really a race car, but the the racer in this case, I'm thinking like Need for Speed, Racer versus Cops. That's why I'm picking these terms. I wanted the racer to actually be hitting the fence. I didn't want to just kind of just drift. I wanted to actually like be impacting the fence. And so in this case, I used a lattice modifier. I could have used a curve modifier as well. The lattice, I think, was a little more direct for me. Curve modifier takes a little bit more setup, in my opinion. But it ended up, you just have to scale the lattice so it's the right dimensions of where you want to deform it, define the resolution, and then in edit mode, move the points of the lattice so that way the fence is deforming to it. You also have to make sure there's enough subdivisions or otherwise geometry to deform on the fence, so I had to increase the subdivisions on that. With textures and HDRIs, honestly, I feel like this has been repeated a lot, just kind of, there's a lot of websites out there, Polyhaven, Polygon, all the others. I was mainly looking for cloudy, overcast skies. I ended up settling for a night scene, which ended up just being turning down the strength of the HDRI. Usually I avoid doing that because the HDRI needs to be its full strength and then you manually adjust the exposure. But in this case, a night HDRI would just basically be very little HDR. So there's probably a better workflow to it, but that's what I ended up doing. In this area, I went through a lot of experimentation. I was trying different camera angles or world brightness. I thought about having the road be curved to kind of match the drifting that was happening. I ended up changing my mind, and you gotta be okay with that. And that's part of the playing around that I first mentioned. You want to be able to experiment and try out different things and let yourself try those different angles, different colors, different lights. Because if you set yourself too much onto one thing, you might be missing better creative opportunities than just the one you first chose. It's also important to save a lot, and not just save a lot, but also have incremental saves, as in you save to different files. I ended up losing like half a day's worth of work that's not depicted here just because I ended up experimenting and I saved and then I realized I wanted to go back, but I didn't have that, and so I had to go back to an autosave just so I could get back to what I was before. So save a lot, but also use incremental saves during this experimental stage, so that way you can always get back to your original idea if you want to go back to it. Next, I was duplicating the car. I mainly was doing this with Alt-D, which allows the data between the two objects to be the same, which can save a lot of memory when rendering. The problem was I already had decided where the original car should be with the empty, and I wanted to keep that but have the shared data. And so what I ended up doing was I selected the empty as the active object. Then I clicked Control P to parent. In the options, the one that worked best was the without inverse option for me. That way the car matched the rotation and position of the empty and was able to keep the original position that I wanted without messing with the rotations. Then I ran into the issue with the materials because I wanted to have the cop car colors and then the racer colors. The problem is because the data is shared, so is the materials associated with that mesh. So how did I fix that? I fixed that by I added another material slot. In the racer, I just had that be a duplicate of the original car paint. And then for the cop car, that would end up being the black and white colors. But since the material data is shared, they can't be different things. Unless you go to this little drop down, instead of mesh data, you select object data. That way the objects can have separate material references, even though they're sharing the same mesh. That way the cop car could have the black and white materials, while the racer would just have the red twice. For making the cop car colors, it was really just a matter of just selecting faces and deciding which parts I wanted black and which parts white. I kept it pretty similar to the original. There wasn't any real reference to Pagani Huayra cop cars, so it was really just a matter of just going after my original color scheme and then deciding if I needed anything extra. Since the subdivisions for the lattice added a lot of geometry, I decided to split up the fence on that side and then just lower the resolution for the farther part of the fence, just so that way it wasn't adding a bunch of geometry that I didn't really need in this case. And same goes for the other side. I just removed or disabled or lowered the settings for the modifiers since they weren't up close. And since this ended up being a night scene, that saved me a lot more time. I realized I needed police sirens for the car. I ended up trying two methods and kind of abandoned the first one, but both should be able to work. Had the cop car as the active object and then parented it. I used the without inverse option again. That's Control P is the keyboard shortcut. The other way was I just took some faces from part of the cop car already, duplicated it with Shift D, and separated with P into its own object. And then I just scaled and extruded to my liking. Add some loop cuts, which is Control R for the keyboard shortcut. And then for making the lights, I just added some blue and red lights similar to the headlights. And I've learned that lights, for cars especially, always look better with glass on top of it. You should never just have the plain emissive shader as the light. It's always good to have glass or other reflective parts around it. It always looks much better. For the glass around the lights, I used Andrew Price's old light paths trick from a very old tutorial of his to remove the caustics. This trick does remove caustics, but it does improve render speed and cleans up a lot of the noise. And I started splitting the glass into its own pieces just so that way the light wasn't kind of bouncing around within the siren mesh. And I assigned some plastic materials to the back just so that way there was some less back illumination on the sirens, so to speak. I decided to try a lighter scene, as in more light, with the overcast HDRI. I used InView's generate mesh frustum operator, which basically just makes a mesh object that represents the camera's view. This is really useful for creating volumes or just rain generators. I use the knife tool, which is K for the keyboard shortcut. It's also a tool on the left-hand side of the 3D view. And for the convex hole operation, I just searched the operator with F3 and just typed in convex hole. And then used edge slide, which is G to grab twice, and then just kind of adjusted all the vertices to a smaller volume and rain area. Then for the rain, I just had it instance a bunch of spheres in the volume and just had that as a placeholder for now. Now for the lighting. I use the Light Painter add-on, which comes with Blender 4.2. It's also downloadable for 4.1. This is one of my add-ons again. So is InView. I don't know if I disclosed that, but InView and Light Painter are my add-ons that I've made. But I really like Light Painter because it allows me to focus on the direction and intent of the lighting. And so when lighting objects, there's obviously the main key lighting, which basically is what do you want to focus on in the scene. And then there's rim lighting, which is kind of more of just trying to bring the silhouette and add some contrast between the object you're trying to light and its background. Then there's also the fill light to make sure that the rest of the object isn't in complete shadow, that you can still see other aspects of your objects. Again, I couldn't find like physically accurate values for the brightness. I'll come back to that later. But I used spot lamps for the street lights just to start with. I thought about changing the car paint, but ended up changing my mind. Rim lighting. So I added some rim lighting for the car's silhouette, especially for the cop car. I wanted it to kind of stand out from the background. I find Light Painter to be very useful. It allows me to do quick lighting setups and then be able to adjust from there. It's not meant to be a one-stop solution. It just helps me be able to get into the right mindset and kind of generally where my lights should be and then just direct it from there. Since I had a volume, the extra lights were adding light to those volumes and kind of made it more apparent that those lights didn't physically exist in the environment, as in like they weren't coming from a street light, they were just positioned in the middle of space. So I ended up turning off the volume scatter for those, just so that way it wouldn't affect the volume as much. But I ended up just not using the volume or rain at all. Even though I'm not done yet, I decided to start doing some basic compositing just so I could get a sense of the final result. I initially started doing it natively, just like I did with my compositing tutorial, which I will leave in the description. I have been recently using the Render Raw add-on, which is made by Orange Turbine, but I've found it really easy to use. It has a really nice interface, so I decided to test it as well. It's not doing any special magic. The nodes are just as available to you as it is behind the add-on. It's just a matter of an easier interface for me. I wanted to make sure the dark scenes still had the properly exposed lights and their glare. I added film grain that, since this is supposed to be a night scene, night photography does tend to be more noisy. Obviously it depends on the camera, but I wanted to emulate that aspect. And when it comes to picking and testing values in the compositor, I found that it's better to jump to extremes than to just test in small increments. Because for me, I like to be able to quickly tell the difference just by looking at it of, okay, I changed this parameter, obviously this changed. It helps me see what has changed in the render just by changing that value. It allows me to better hone in of what direction I want to go with the value and then hone in on what setting I want. Now, I mentioned the light fix earlier, so I added physically correct lights, and that was thanks to the extra lights add-on. CG Cookies talked about this a while ago, but I really like it. I bought it just for this time lapse, and it ended up working really well. And I just used the blend file as an asset browser instead of using the add-on part. It ended up working really well, and I was able to just copy and paste values as needed. Corrected the lamps. I added another area lamp as bounce lighting back to the cop car, since the cop car's lighting on the racer would bounce back onto the front of it. It also kind of gave more presence to the cop car. And I used the street lamps. I added some more in the background, although they're technically in the middle of the street physically. It kind of made the silhouette more clear to the camera. Another note with that, don't be afraid to kind of break real world physics or where things are supposed to be in space. Like, don't worry about that. Art is not meant to be a purely physical, photorealistic representation of the world. don't be afraid to change some things for the sake of the artistic style and technique of your render. For a car render, there's always one person that you can't forget.
Oh, your driver.
Thankfully, one of the other add-ons I have, which I'm not using here, which is Launch Control, it includes a driver asset as part of the product, which is great. So I'm going to use this driver. So I just appended it to the scene. It was a reference. It's initially an instance, so that you can't actually pose anything yet. So in this case, you have to make instances real. That's with Control A. That's one of the options at the bottom. Now I noticed that this operator by default doesn't preserve your parent-child relationships. So all these objects just become a flat array of objects. But I found in the redo panel, if you check those checkboxes, the hierarchy is preserved, which is perfect. So that way our rig is easier to use. I removed the helmet, just since we don't want this to be a stock race car driver. I just needed a general person. So I just put the driver into place, I posed him a little bit. Again, since this is behind a car window and at night, I don't really need to do anything special. It's just a matter of just getting the general pose and feel right. I did add a light in the interior of the racer car just to make it more clear that there was a driver in there. Otherwise it just kind of looked like a slight reflection of the character. So I did add a lamp in there just to make it more clear. And then for the cop car, we still need someone in there. So I linked duplicate again, which is Alt D, and just moved and reposed that character. Alright, I reorganized the street lights into their own collection just for better organization. And again, further defined the silhouette behind the car, made the road a little more wet or shiny, just so it would pop out a little more. I tested a backlight to shine on the road to make it a little more reflective, changed my mind. And then I finally did what I've been procrastinating to do, which was add sparks to the impact of the racer with the fence. I just used a classic particle system. I didn't want to try to remake it in geometry nodes. I've done it a little bit with Escape, but I'm not there yet. Once I found a sense of movement that I liked, I baked to cache. Then I made a simple spark shader that was completely ripped from Andrew Price's old tutorial on sparks. And from there I transitioned back into compositing. For compositing, I mentioned all this briefly in the compositing tutorial of mine, again linked in the description. But the vector scope on the right side of the image editor, it shows kind of the general hues and saturation of your image, and the waveform histogram above it kind of maps out the values of your image. I used Render Raw's hue to hue subpanel to shift the reds and the blues to kind of match closer to their quote-unquote true color in the vector scope. As for adjusting glare, I wanted to still keep it pretty bright but not overwhelming. For the vignette, I did shift it a little bit off just absolute center, just so the sparks wouldn't be dimmed down. And from there, I added motion blur. You can do this in the compositor with a vector pass, but I found it better to just do it in camera, especially with cycles. I literally just moved the ground plane and the cars for a few frames, and just rendered again and compared the amount, and then made sure the motion blur was as much as I wanted it to be. I did increase the shutter open time to the full length. Most of the time half is perfect. You really should only adjust this unless you're really trying to match other camera shots. Also, this is another good reason why parenting your objects is important, because it made sure my drivers and the interior light follow the cars. Otherwise, something will just feel off, as some things should be moving but they are not. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope this helps you with your renders. I hope this improves your workflow and gives you a better mindset of how to make your renders more cinematic and more interesting. Thank you, and happy blending.